Hey everyone, and welcome to Almost Cancelled. I am Peter, and I'm going to be talking about Legion Season 3, Episodes 3 and 4, which are Chapters 22 and 23. So, full spoilers for the episodes, as always. Worth mentioning, of course, that this series of Legion reviews is sponsored by one of our patrons, Cindy Palacios, so thank you to her for supporting the show. So apologies, first of all, for this being a double and being kind of late even at that. So, things got really busy, but I'm catching up here with 3 and 4. As I record this, I think 5's airing tonight, and I'll have 5 sometime this week. But so 3 and 4 are very different episodes, which actually at least makes it a little bit easier in my head to separate them. Because sometimes the problem with doing 2 episodes at the same time is that they can kind of blur together. 3 is a very focused, stylized episode. Well, they're both stylized, but 3 is a very stylized episode where we spend time in the past with Xavier and his wife Gabrielle and baby David. It becomes clear throughout the episode that David and Switch have travelled back in time and are in some way witnessing the events that are happening. Although it does kind of play a little bit differently to them, because typically when we've seen her time travel before, it's just been, she goes to the place and she's there. Whereas this is a little bit different than that. Where it feels like it's being amplified with whatever Carrie's built for them, where it's more mental, because throughout the episode Gabrielle starts having like mental flashes of David being a hippie and singing. But we hear him and Switch talking to each other and like try to like discuss what they're there to do and so on and so on. This episode's kind of like a weird in the middle for me, because it feels like it should be really exciting, and them traveling back is kind of exciting, sort of seeing how David might have inadvertently been responsible for the Shadow King getting to him is kind of interesting, because he's there and he's, Xavier's so distracted with dealing with David, which he doesn't know is his son. He just thinks there's an entity in the house that's messing with Gabrielle. He's actually distracted, and that's when the Shadow King goes into David, which is a wonderful shot of like a face almost appearing out of the walls and then kind of like going into David like it's smoke. Really interesting visual. That stuff is pretty good, and it was very fascinating. I have to admit though, I don't think I necessarily needed a full episode of Xavier and Gabrielle. This felt like it could have been a subplot in an episode otherwise doing other things. Like, I get the symmetry, I get the cyclical nature of like Xavier meeting Gabrielle in a mental hospital, just kind of like how David met Sid. That's obviously really obvious and neat. And there's a couple of nice scenes, like when he just decides maybe it's time for us to leave, and he uses his powers to just have everyone let them go, and he essentially even kind of like cheer them on as they're leaving. And they fall for each other. And in fact, my favorite scene of the episode actually might be, there's a scene in the war where Xavier uses his powers to defend himself against an enemy soldier, and actually makes the soldier shoot himself in the head. But he clearly doesn't necessarily, like, with a clear mind, really want to do that. This is more of in the heat of the moment, he's defending himself, and he just makes him do the thing that will make him feel the safest. And obviously this is something that he kind of regrets and lives with, and he understands the weight of his power, and that it needs to be controlled. Because obviously Xavier's a character just in traditional X-Men lore who is very kind of noble or whatever. Although that said, I've been reading some early X-Men stuff recently for the comics podcast, and he's got a couple of creepy moments, does L.A. Xavier, in those comics. So like, but honestly, like, a lot of Gabrielle being alone in the house and like being upset that Xavier's gone, and feeling like, I don't know, like, I feel like there could have been more done maybe with the horror movie-esque part of it, where she feels something's invading or something's in the house. We could have maybe played with those tropes a little bit more. As it is, I think it feels like it does that holy thing where sometimes an entire episode will be used to make a point that could have probably been made in about 10 minutes. Which is not always a bad thing necessarily, because sometimes the style of what it's doing is what makes it unique. But I think with last season of Legion, I definitely grew tired of how it was being handled in some cases, where it didn't feel like there was enough actually in there narratively or dramatically to really be worth spending time with. The big one last season I remember talking about with Connor was, and it's actually kind of relevant to episode 4 that we'll get to in a minute, is the episode where we actually got a lot of Sid's backstory in her past, and we got to see kind of the events she'd spoken about before. And it was very stylized. It was, was doing the episode, but the problem was that we'd heard so much about what happened in this part of the story that it felt like it didn't really offer us anything. It's certainly not a full episode's worth of material. In this episode, while we didn't necessarily hear a lot of this stuff with these parents, I don't necessarily think it needed a full episode devoted to actually developing that relationship. Or maybe the complaint here for me is less that that it shouldn't have had a full episode, and more that it didn't work for me as a full episode because I never really quite cared about them as a pair. I never quite bought into Xavier and Gabrielle in a way where I cared about them on their own. And I think some of this episode does kind of rely on caring about Gabrielle because she's kind of the character who's vulnerable and she's the one we're supposed to be concerned about. And I don't think I ever really felt that. So it made some of the stuff where, like I say, she's upset that Xavier's gone because Xavier goes to try and find Shadow King. He's become aware of a mutant presence, and he goes to find it. And he comes back, and the implication is that he's had the war with Shadow King already. Like he's because he phones at one point and says that he's a monster and I should never have come and so on and so on. And then when he gets back, that's when the David inadvertently kind of causes his own possession, if you want to call it that. So, it's got those little stylistic touches of like cutting to the Shadow King walking through the beads to imply that he's on his way, that he's coming, and it's kind of building up. I just don't think it needs a full episode. I think as a subplot that took maybe a quarter of an episode that was doing other things, this was a fine few scenes that I really liked. But a lot of the episode did feel like, I didn't necessarily need the whole romance. I didn't necessarily need like Gabrielle on her own, like caring about this stuff, and being like, a nervous wreck because something's happening, thinking that she may also be going crazy. That stuff never really clicked for me that much. So I'm kind of in the middle on this episode, on episode 3. Luckily though, I actually am far more positive on episode 4. Episode 4, really feels much more to me like it had an idea for an episode. Let's do an episode where these time demons, because Switch and David get back, and because they've been traveling too far and messing with time, the time demons start messing with time and sort of break out into the real world. And they have a fantastic design slash effect when they're out in the real world. We never see them really move in motion. We see a lot of still frames of them kind of like leaping from place to place. It bizarrely reminded me of Five Nights at Freddy, just like the creepy, like monstrous things just sort of like, jumping from spot to spot. And we hear this sort of clicking or ticking in the soundtrack that kind of goes in time with it. And it's really on and off beat kind of thing. This was a fantastic kind of atmosphere for the episode, and I got way more into this episode because it was still continuing a lot of character beats, and there's some really nice character beats in this episode, but it gave me something that felt like a tangible, like, a villain that needed to be defeated, but more importantly, the villain was just kind of cool and kind of had this really unique look to them. Very early on, we see like time anomalies start to happen on the ship, with the Division 3, and then we actually arguably one of the best things in the episode is Sid talking to her younger self because of what the time demons are doing, and this actually is where I said that episode last season where we saw Sid's backstory becomes relevant. Sid's backstory, like that episode last season, I thought added very little to the story. Like, we'd already heard about how she lost her virginity, and it was kind of this traumatic deal. We didn't necessarily need a whole episode building up to it that did the actual kind of like moment last season. This conversation with her younger self added way more to it than that episode ever did. Because not only was it, because obviously we understood that it was horrifying, the idea that she then switched with her mom, and she was in there in the shower with this boyfriend, right? We already knew that. I mean, knew that was kind of like this shock, and but we never really got the sense, I think, last season, and when we'd heard about this before, how it was still kind of unconsensual, and in the sense where when we hear young Sid describe it, just a couple of years maybe after this happened, she describes it as she went in there to feel something, and he, seeing, her mother, kind of forcefully turned her around and started having sex with her. And she talks about having her face pressed up against the glass and kind of how horrifying it is. And hearing her talk about her experience, and hear her like hope she was going to feel something, loving or romantic, or just a connection with someone, because that's what she expected to come from a sexual encounter, and instead being scared, instead being kind of forcefully handled like that, adds a lot more to that scene and that part of the backstory, I think, than that episode did last season. And not even closely, because I think it adds a lot of sympathy to her side of it. That there was sympathy there already, but this like turns it up quite a bit, because it relates it to what happened with David when older Sid is describing, because younger Sid wants to know that things get better, and she's like, "Oh, I fell in love," and this, and he was, obviously his powers were very, crazy, and he tried to keep a handle on it. And when younger Sid asks what happens and why it didn't, go, why they're not still together, she just says, "He turned me around," and it neatly kind of like connects the two experiences, where there was some willingness and consent to begin with, but in both examples, that trust was in some way betrayed. And they're not 1-to-1, but her relating that to her younger self, and making not that we really had to explain why what David did was wrong, because David outright sexually assaulted her. That was something we pointed out as soon as it happened, because it really left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. And obviously David continues on this path, where in this episode he is very much egotistical. He gives everyone in his little cult an orgasm, essentially, which Lenny kind of like fights back, says, "Yeah, okay, we get it, the ego trip, we all want to sleep with you, come on, we have to deal with this." And he gets upset with her and says, "Watch your tone. If you don't be nice to me, I can't be nice to you." And it sounds like an abusive asshole talking. It really does. His ego and his manipulation and thinking that he is God. In fact, he literally ends this episode, or close to the ending, with saying that he is a god. That's ultimately how we defeat the time demons, which are affecting everyone, including Division 3. But he essentially says, "You know what, enough of this. I am God." And he just, makes one of them burst into flames and wins the fight right there and then. Up until that point, there's a lot of fun stuff going on with him, though. They kind of make Carrie remember that he was mind washed by David into doing what he's doing, and he, now being himself, decides to save Switch and run out with her. And there's like a time trap at one point where anyone who walks towards the front door will be caught in time and just frozen still, which is a really neat visual and idea. And it leads to them using the tunnel from episode 1, the tunnel that Switch went through, which is still there, and they climb out of that and get to a phone that then teleports them up to the ship, because of course they have that tech. But no, David is a complete god complex maniac at this point. He really is. He is not even remotely sympathetic. And it almost makes me wonder if the point of this show is that's what the point of this show has been the entire time, is to get to this point and explore the idea of him thinking is this powerful, and how do we approach that healthily, this abuse of power. And if that's what the show's all about, then great. I do think it stumbles here or there and kind of getting to here, though. Mainly with how self-indulgent some of the episodes can really be. But whereas, this episode I thought handled things quite well, and we had the really artsy kind of still frame silent film section of the episode, where Farouk can fight the demons a little bit, and he takes Clark and Carrie into the time, or the space between time, or time between times, or whatever he called it, and it's this other dimension where the time demons won't have an advantage, but everything's in still frames and silent, so there's subtitles coming up, and we get the kind of the old, almost German expressionist filmmaking kind of style portion of the episode. And I really had fun with this, because it was a subplot. It wasn't it was neat because we got a fight scene in this, and it looked really cool, and it was all these great images of them fighting the time demons. And I think the reason why this works for me, where some other stuff on this show does feel a bit self-indulgent and like it's wasting time, is this is a subplot that ties into what the main plot of the episode is, It's adding more context to an extent and more mythology to what the main plot's doing, but it's not actually the core drive of the episode. It's establishing these time demons as being really tough to beat, which tells us at the end when David just does it with a snap of his fingers that like how powerful David's really become. And David's, he's got a plot before that where the time demons kind of trick him into thinking he's in a prison cell next to his mother. And of course he eventually realizes that it's all a lie, but he really does have these problems. And when he finds out at the end that Carrie rescued Switch and they ran off, he basically says we're going to war with Division. Like that's the final moment of the episode, and it's again his ego. He can't not think he's in the right. He not a single fiber of his being thinks that he might be doing something bad or wrong. So on that level, this episode delivers really well. I thought the Sid talking to younger self added so much to her character that really, I think, gave it a nice emotional touch to her trying to beat David in a way that was kind of missing before, is hearing her kind of like essentially have a self-monologue to herself talking about this stuff. I thought was really effective. And then there's some other really fun stuff as well, or sad stuff, where Lenny has to sort of experience her entire daughter's life that she's kind of like going to raise with this other woman in the cult. She kind of like jumps through time, and she stays the same age, but her daughter is getting older to the point where she's on her deathbed. And again, it was a really fun sequence. I mean, David finds her at the end in the street. She's just on the ground outside, like crying in a fetal position, like it's broken her, this experience. So, and like I said, Carrie and Switch getting out the place, like I really like the time demons like jumping around behind the wall at them. We see them around the corner kind of jumping and kind of keeping an eye on them. All of that stuff I just thought was really kind of fun and playful, like, and a really great visual. I loved how the time demons were kind of blurred, and you got kind of like a spiky cat kind of thing going on that you could kind of see almost sometimes, but the eyes were lighting up, but it was mostly this blurry kind of idea of like something we can't quite comprehend, and they move through time differently than we do. So no, I was really into this stuff. So yeah, episode 3, like I thought I had some nice moments and scenes, but ultimately I thought dragged a little bit and felt like it spent too much time on a relationship that just wasn't quite clicking for me. Episode 4 I think had a really cool idea with the time demons, which were implemented in different ways. If anything, I'm almost disappointed that it was only one episode. Like I could have taken a 2-parter probably of the time demons, and it did more with the idea of like the time traps where like people were freezing if they went close to that door. Like we could have done so much more with that stuff, I think, which isn't a complaint so much. It's just like this had so much potential in its ideas. And I think David's stuff with his mother was probably the weakest element of the episode for me, just because I didn't like her that much in the previous episode, so I didn't really like her in this one either, even though it turned out not to be her. I did like seeing the actress, though. The actress is from Mr. Robot. She played Joanna. And I'm going to get her name because I can't remember her second name. Stephanie Corneliuson. Is the actress. She was great on Mr. Robot. And it's not a problem with her performance. I just think the relationship with her and Xavier it just never really worked for me, which is a shame. Because there's good stuff in there. There is. But I think it's mostly at the end of the episode for me. Whereas episode 4 I actually think's probably the best episode of the season. I think episodes 1 and 4 are the 2 best episodes. I think 2 and 3 were a bit weaker, especially 3. So hopefully episode 5 gives us another good one that I'm enthusiastic about. But yeah, so there you go. That is my thoughts on the last 2 episodes of Legion, and I'll be back with episode 5 sometime this week. So thank you very much for watching or listening. I appreciate it a ton. I almost said we because I'm used to saying we because there's usually 2 of us. I guess I'm saying we in the Male Fuzz TV appreciates it kind of way. But no, thank you very much. You can of course let me know in the comments what you thought of these episodes. You can like and subscribe, that helps out a lot. as does, of course, going to patreon.com/MailFuzzTV, where you can support us financially and keep the shows ticking and keep all the content coming. Much like Cindy Palacios, who's used one of the higher tiers to sponsor this show. You can, of course, support us for as little as $1 per month, and every dollar matters a lot. So go have a look and see if you're interested in the bonus stuff that's on offer, or you just want to feel warm and fuzzy on the inside. Mildly fuzzy, you might say. But go and have a look at that. Get me on Twitter at Wibble89, or you can get MailFuzz TV on Twitter at mailed_fuzz for channel updates. And check out all the content we're doing. Obviously, me and Connor do television for the multiverse every week, which is all the DC shows that are going on, that we're discussing those. And of course, we also have a bunch of other shows. We have a horror movie podcast called Screams After Midnight that I do with Tim. We have a sci-fi movie podcast called The Atomic Cinema Experiment, The Ace, which I do with Tara. And then there's obviously classic TV reviews of Twilight Zone and Star Trek and all sorts of things. So thank you once again for watching or listening. We always appreciate it. Keep watching TV, guys. Have you got any vanilla?